The Tees from moor to sea, the mighty River Tees, from cold night to industrial might. This film will take you on an 85-mile journey along the entire length of one of Britain's great rivers, through stunning landscapes, captured as never before from the air. Witness thriving wildlife on this magnificently diverse stretch of water. Dive into rich heritage and explore how industry harnessed the dark waters of the Tees to shape this ancient landscape, changing the world forever. We begin our journey at the peak of the Pennines, 893 metres above sea level, at a place known as Cross Fell. This is the highest point in England, outside of the peaks of the Lake District, and at first glance it is a harsh landscape, known for its fierce helm wind, named so for the helmet of clouds that adorn the fell, foretelling the wind's arrival. Indeed, it has been said the mountain used to be known as Fiend's Fell and was the home of evil spirits. It is speculated it only became known as Crossfell due to the actions of one Saint Augustine of Canterbury, he having blessed the mountain in the 6th century, presumably dealing with these demons. Of course, the plateau is and remains home of something far more deadly than demons, the northern cold. This is one of the coldest places in England. Snow can fall in June and be present as late as July, and in the true depths of winter, it is transformed into something out of myth. While this landscape may appear to be a frozen desert, it is in fact anything but. Look closer and you will find an ecosystem known as Sicilus alpine and boreal grassland. Cross Fell being one of the best examples of such in England and one of the very few predominantly near natural ecosystems left in the UK. This being an ecosystem that is largely as it was prior to human interference. As such, it is classified as a Special Area of Conservation, or SAC for short, and grazing of the uplands by sheep and other livestock is prohibited. The windswept land is covered in rare alpine plants, such as starry saxifrage, mountain forget-me-not, and perhaps most famously of all, the Teasdale spring gentian. This vivid purple flower is about the size of a lawn daisy and grows only here. It is hard to spot and will only open fully on sunny spring days. Dropping down from the peaks and moorlands, there is a sign of things to come. Green Reservoir was completed in 1971 at a cost of £2.2 million. That's around 31 million in 2024. Built by 300 construction workers, the 550 metre long, 25 metre high dam took 4 years to complete. The need for such a structure was to store and steadily release water downstream, which was important for the industries and water treatment works of the Tees Valley. Indeed, combined, the water treatment works now produce 300 million litres of drinking water a day. The dam is unusual in being made from two sections of differing construction, one an earthen bank and the other concrete. This seems to be due to the compositions of the opposing hillsides, one being rock and the other softer material. Given the rarity and precious nature of the ecosystems here, the construction of the Green Dam faced opposition from conservationists. The protests held the project up for over a decade. When construction did finally begin, Sir Charles Allison, chairman of the Water Board, detonated an explosive at the site to signal the start of the project, blowing a large crater in the landscape. There's a possibility this choice of beginning was not a coincidence with the years of frustration he had faced in trying to get the dam built. Around 1/10 of the Teasdale spring gentian's habitat would end up being destroyed by the end of the project. Always my boy of wish returns to see those peat-stained desert birds that feed the weird Tyne Tees and turning states to strata seas. How basalt long oppressed broke out in wild revolt at Cauldron Snout. Cauldron Snout is potentially the longest waterfall in England, and as Auden writes, it flows over the basalt outcrops of the Wind Sill, a collection of extrusions of basaltic magma that are responsible for many waterfalls in northern England. Formed 295 million years ago, the Wind Sill formed during a time when Meganeura, a dragonfly with a 2.5-foot wingspan, flew in the skies of the Earth. As our journey continues, this will not be our last encounter with the Wind Sill. Beyond Cauldron Snout, the river follows a steep, secluded valley through the high moorlands of the central Pennines. Having dropped 60 metres over the falls of Cauldron Snout, this is a much more enclosed landscape surrounded by many cliffs and crags. However, make no mistake, we are still 400 metres above sea level, and the climate here is still a harsh one, with few trees. The Tees meets one of its first major tributaries here. Mays Beck drains Dufton, Merton and Mickle Fells to the west. Indeed, it may only be the fact that the waterway we have followed so far starts further away from the mouth of the Tees that gives it the honour of being named as the river's source. This is one of many ultimately fairly arbitrary ways to define the concept of a source in the context of rivers. In reality, every bit of overland flow will contribute to the river's discharge depending on catchment size, rainfall, ground conditions and vegetation. As a child, I was obsessed with trying to find the sources of rivers. This was partially driven by the notion that these sources were mystical places where if you stuck your finger in the spring there, the entire river system would magically just cease. The bottom of the valley has a few small marshes that surround the river. Grazing animals are also more common here, with the rare alpine plants of the higher moorlands being less prevalent. Below the dramatic cliffs of Cronkley Scar, the valley of the Tees opens up into a wide plateau of hills and streams. Here the valley meets another significant tributary known as Harwood Beck, with a catchment to the northwest. This is the last major upland tributary of the Tees for some distance, though many small streams will continue to add to its discharge as we head onward. As the Tees enters a series of tight meanders, the valley sides steepen significantly, and on the northern bank we see the Forsgarth Quarry. Used to harvest hundreds of thousands of tonnes of dolomite rock per year, which is used as building material throughout northern England, it opened in 1932 and is believed to contain 18 million tonnes of reserves as of 2012. Forsgarth is currently worked by Cemex UK operations. It is now we arrive at one of the most famous landmarks in all of County Durham. High Force is a contender for the largest waterfall in England. No other in the country has such a large volume of water dropping so far unbroken. The cascade is 20 metres high, dropping over the hard igneous rock of the Wind Sill into a gorge it has been carving out for millennia. The name High Force is likely derived from the Norse word foss, meaning simply waterfall, a common naming convention in this area of England that was once invaded and settled by Nordic peoples. so the literal name of this place is High Waterfall, though High Force seems perfectly appropriate as well. A famous painter, J.M.W. Turner, would paint the waterfall in the summer of 1816. Indeed, it's not hard to see why High Force is so widely regarded. It has a unique and dramatic look of which there is little comparison in Britain. Surrounded by woodland, the look of the falls changes throughout the year, the autumn display being particularly tranquil. High Force was the first place we truly encountered woodlands on the Tees. Oak, ash, beech, birch, cherry, among others, will be common feature of the banks of the river from now on. Heading down the gorge, the landscape slowly opens into a U-shaped valley, typical of the dales of northern England. The river here meanders and braids, forming islands. The banks and the islands play host to a plethora of plants and trees. On sunny spring days, these wildflowers put on a truly magical display, framed in glorious warmth by the soft leaves of the birches. This little world is one of the first places we start to see discarded waste from humans tainting the landscape on a regular basis. One can only hope that respect and understanding for this wonderful place will only continue to grow, as ultimately this is a battle for motivation to be better more than anything else. There is a great variety of wildflowers here, such as bluebells, wood anemones, dandelions, lesser celandines, wood cranesbill, cowslips, violets, marsh marigolds, orchids, primroses, devil's bit scabious, and probably far more that I've missed. Indeed, I tend to discover a new wildflower frequently on my spring visits to this area, with the devil's bit scabious being my last discovery. It is here we start to see more animals typical of British rivers, normally occupying the calmer waters between the rapids and the islands. The drakes, in particular, seem to like this stretch of river, with plenty of large stones and islands for them to stand on, undisturbed. As we pass over some rapids between islands, there is yet another encounter with the Wyn Sill. This is Low Force, the much less famous little sibling of High Force. Both falls mark changes in the character of the Tees. Above High Force, the river flows through a harsh upland landscape, whilst below it is marked by rapids flowing between lush islands of trees and flowers. Passing over Low Force, the river calms. Whilst there are rapids and falls below this point, they are far fewer in number and lesser in scale, with the banks full of trees and life. Just below Low Force is Winch Bridge. Originally constructed by lead miners in the 18th century, made of hand-forged wrought iron chains, this bridge collapsed in 1802, drowning one man in the deep water below. The current structure was built as a replacement for this bridge in 1830, paid for by the Duke of Cleveland, and maintained off the miners' subscriptions. The bridge is exciting to cross, with a narrow walkway swaying and bobbing underfoot over the dark, fast-flowing waters of the Tees. Only one person is meant to cross at a time, with the sign over each end of the bridge stating as such. It is used by many walkers to this day and is a Grade 2 listed building. Moving on from the waterfalls, the Tees meanders through a classic dale of northern England. Wider and shallower than the next dale south, Swaledale, Teasdale would have likely taken its current form during the last glacial maximum, a time when the valley bottom would have been filled with a slow-moving river of ice, carving out its classic U-shape. One mystery with the Tees is the origin of its name. There is a theory circulating that it came from the Brittonic tes, meaning warmth, or the Welsh tea, claimed to mean dung, both in the context of the river's colour. However, I can't find any more references to tes in Welsh or Brittonic, and tea in modern Welsh actually means you, as in you there, so I'd take this theory with a big pinch of salt. It is possible that the surnames Tees and Surtees are also linked to the River Tees, but this is not supported by any direct evidence either. Middleton in Teasdale is known from church records to have existed at least as far back as the 12th century. with its Anglo-Saxon name suggesting an even earlier origin. Middleton has served as a farming centre for most of its existence, with an interlude of lead mining in the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, Middleton is a centre for walkers, serving residents and tourists alike with a collection of shops and cafes. Below Middleton, the significant tributary, the River Lune, joins the Tees. We then pass by Eggleston Bridge, below Eggleston Hall, built in 1918 as a present for the returning son of Sir William Grey after the Great War. The Tees now turns southward and passes through a tight wooded channel that separates the classic U-shaped valley around Middleton with the vast open valleys of Lower Teasdale. Here we pass by yet another 12th century village, Coverston, previous home of local celebrity Hannah Huxwell. This site is part of Project Pipeline, a new water distribution system in the Tees Valley. Here, the 800mm water main passes under the Tees before continuing to head east to Darlington and Bishop Auckland, connecting them to the Lartington Water Treatment Works on the other side of the river to the west. It has long been held that many rivers have spirits. These entities are manifestations of a river's character and can share wisdom pertaining to it. The Tees has its own legend of a vicious spirit who is responsible for many a drowning. Her story is a warning to people to respect the Tees' dark and powerful waters. Cloud on the top fell, fiendish, a shrieking helm of chaos, just how I like it. Who cares if Augustine came and crossed it? A big bowl of foreboding, my soak. Green cow, newfangled, I can work with it though. I know how to slip by unnoticed, peak cloak heavy, toppling down valley to where I can take my time. Dark, wash slow, before the flow, pitching bold, a washout crash to treacle depths of umber. I can agitate all I want down here, funnel my froth to vent my load, tongs out, birch twigs, pinch a passing colorant far too bright for my patch, flew past at speed, didn't drop dye into my deep. I was pleased. Scraped in scabious, bit of the devil. I've learnt it can heal, not my business healing. I'm for pushing, pulling, forcing, darkening my pot of mud-toad grey, mahogany brown, black walnut bark, as down and round, tumbling loud, digress, annoy, dare to trespass, croak about suds or stare, my long arms snatch and drag you in, take you down, green tress entrails curling round, closing your eyes to the light above as I sluice my threat in this basement. In this cormorant darkness, my locks will ever slam the windsill rock. Perilous, Powler, Peg is my tag. You'd be wise to stay clear. Hidden in the woods above Barnard Castle is yet another relic of the past. Two mighty stone arches stand up on each bank of the Tees. With such a span between them, it is sometimes hard to believe these were once connected. This is the Tees Viaduct, or at least what is left of it, a great railway bridge built in 1857 for the South Durham and Lancashire Union Railway. Originally at a length of 253 metres and towering 40 metres above the river, this was probably the largest railway viaduct in Teasdale. The viaduct would remain until the 1970s, when the closing of the railway a decade earlier finally spelt doom for the structure after standing for 114 years. Tees Viaduct was demolished in 1972, and incredibly, this process was captured by Fred Gregory, a local resident, on a series of transparencies preserved and shared by his son Paul. Paul remembers taking the train to school over the viaduct every day, and then walking over it as a shortcut in the 1960s after the railway closed. A Aside from the massive stone arches remaining on the banks, large pieces of the ironwork can still be seen in the river from time to time when the water is low. Along the banks here are the woodlands of Marwood, Tees Bank and Flats Wood. These are some of the larger and more established woodlands along the Tees, with many older oaks, ashes and beeches. In the spring, the tree trunks emerge from a sea of flowers. Wood anemones carpet the woodland in April, with the odd celandine sparkling yellow in the ocean of white. These are followed by wild garlic and British bluebells, at the end of the month leading into May. The smell of the garlic is palpable. Insects such as this orange-tipped butterfly will start to appear as the weather warms. The riverbanks here play host to dense foliage, not least globe flowers and marsh marigolds. This is perfect for wildlife. Drakes are common here, liking to breed and shelter their young amongst the coves of the riverbank. They are joined by mandarin ducks, whose striking plumage is a treat for anyone lucky enough to spot them. They are shy and will dart away readily if disturbed. Cormorants sit on the various fallen trees in the river, again showing the value of allowing trees to grow on the banks and live out their full life cycle before succumbing to the river. Many more birds can be seen on the river here, including spotted sandpipers scurrying between the rocks and oyster catchers standing in the open areas where they can see a threat coming from plenty far away. Dr. George Edwards, a local philanthropist, recognised the value of the woods to people's health and laid out a series of paths to allow access to the woods nearest to Barnard Castle. This may sound like a modern scheme, and indeed it's something pretty progressive in concept. However, Dr. Edwards lived 200 years ago, and this project was primarily meant for the industrial workers of the town, who lived in squalid conditions working at places such as the Ullathorne flax mill. The doctor believed access to the woods on a regular basis would improve the poor health, and while the woodlands are not likely to cure the plethora of ailments caused by the exploitative work practices of this time, we do now know that being in a woodland greatly improves the mental health for the majority of humans. We now approach the historic town of Barnard Castle, known affectionately as Barney to many. The town is named for its historic castle, mostly built by the Bialio family during the 12th and 13th centuries. The castle was named for the nephew of the Bacard knight Guy de Bialio, that nephew being named Barnard. Barnard would be responsible for enlarging the castle to its current extent, and it would then become known as Castrum Barnardi, or Barnard's Castle. There was likely fortification here long prior to the arrival of Guy de Bialio and Barnard, with this being an important crossing point of the Tees since Roman times for their Transpennine Roman road. The castle has faced multiple sieges during its history. The first was in 1216 after the death of King John, when many barons rebelled in support of an invasion by King Alexander II of Scotland. The French were also occupying some of England at the time, which didn't help. The Scottish king's brother-in-law, Eustace, would be shot by a crossbowman from the walls of Barnard's Castle, dying from the wound shortly thereafter. The loss of this champion weakened the rebels' cause, and they would be routed the following year by King Henry III's forces. Barnard's Castle passed into the hands of Richard Plantagenet, later King Richard III, between 1471 and 1485. He made many repairs and alterations to the castle, the oriel window of the great chamber still being visible, with the underside of the lintels bearing his boar heraldry. The castle faced its last notable siege in 1569, during the Rising of the North. Sir George Bowes held the castle in an 11-day siege in support of Queen Elizabeth I, against the Roman Catholic nobility trying to replace her with Queen Mary Stuart. A 5,000-strong sieging army faced roughly 750-man garrison in the castle. After capturing much of the fortress and cutting the water supply, Sir George surrendered to the rebels. The damage from the siege would never be repaired, and the castle's fall into ruination would begin here. The castle would be plundered for materials for the construction of Sir Henry Vane's seat of power at Raby. This left it of little use during the English Civil War. The round tower of the castle would house a hermit from around 1841. Frank Shields said he was a recluse, antiquary, and artist in painting. He would guide visitors around the castle until a conflict with a neighbour led to his eviction. He'd moved to Eggleston Abbey before eventually being forced into a lunatic asylum, apparently justified by his obsession with goats. He died in the asylum in 1881. The castle ruins would remain an important local resource, being used for annual agricultural shows throughout the second half of the 19th century. After a gale damaged the ruins in 1896, Lord Barnard would eventually put the ruins under the guardianship of the Ministry of Works. The Ministry of Works would eventually evolve into the Department of the Environment, predecessor to English Heritage, who still manage the castle today. Below the castle is County Bridge. Dating from the 14th century, this bridge actually managed to survive the Great Flood of 1771, though it did need some repairs after. The bridge is still fully used to this day, and it is protected with a weight limit and single-file traffic. While it is difficult to confirm this, I think this might well be the oldest bridge still standing on the Tees. As we head downstream of Barney, the river passes over several small falls and rapids interspersed with calm pools. Near these pools, if you're patient and a little lucky, you may catch a glimpse of an electric blue amongst the foliage or skimming over the tanned water. Above the banks of the Tees, just south of Barnard Castle, stand some intriguing ruins. The Abbey of St Mary and St John the Baptist was founded between 1195 and 1198 according to English Heritage. Known as Eggleston Abbey today, it was founded by Premonstratensians, an austere order of Roman Catholicism, established by St Norbert of Xanten in 1120 and approved by Rome in 1126. The finances of Eggleston Abbey were never good. Indeed, in the 13th century, the abbot of Primtree sent 3 English abbots to hold an inquiry to whether Eggleston should even be considered an abbey, and whilst it would remain an abbey, its residents would be living in relative poverty, particularly during times of war. The abbey passed to Robert Strelley during the dissolution of the monasteries in 1548, who proceeded to convert it into a mansion. Later, in 1770, John Morris of Rockaby Hall bought the abbey off Sir Thomas Robson, and a descendant of Morret would place the ruins under the guardianship of the state in 1925. Many stone artworks were returned after this, including the tomb of Sir Ralph Bowes of Streatham, who died in 1482. The site is now managed by English Heritage. Moving downstream, we arrive at where the River Greta meets the Tees. Draining a major catchment to the west, this is a significant tributary and is even marked on OS maps as the meeting of the waters. Below the picturesque village of Walton is the historic Walton Bridge. One of the oldest surviving examples of an iron-toned suspension bridge in Britain, Walton Bridge opened in 1831 with the purpose of providing a route for horse and carts carrying coal to cross the Tees on their way from the Durham coalfields. The bridge was assessed in 1914 and a 3-ton weight limit was implemented, a limit that would remain in place until very recently. In December 1942, Winston Churchill stood on the bridge and watched soldiers in the Tees below practicing river crossings in the suitably challenging conditions the river offered. In 2019, the bridge was closed to vehicles due to a damage report, and in December 2020, the bridge was closed to all pedestrians as well. For a few years, the fate of the bridge was unclear. However, in summer of 2023, the repair of the bridge's 193-year-old chains that still supported the full weight of the bridge was confirmed. The refurbishment of the bridge is to be carried out by Volker Laser, an infrastructure specialist. As of September 2024, the work has started and the bridge is now being dismantled, so its parts can be assessed and restored as necessary. Walton Bridge is due to be re-erected in early 2025 and restored to a fully open state to pedestrians and vehicles by the spring. Here's hoping it will stand for another 200 years. Continuing downstream, we pass over a beautiful long diagonal waterfall, typical of the mid-course of the Tees. This is another good spot to see waterbirds, though they are shy and will often disappear at the first sight of people. Beyond Walton, the river flows over an unusual piece of inclined bedrock, possibly another showing of the Windsill, before meandering past the small village of Overington. Here, the river suddenly becomes straighter, giving a clear view of a bridge famous for a very unique reason. Opened in 1763, Winston Bridge was designed by Sir Thomas Robson of Rockerby Park, and claimed at the time to be the longest span of any bridge in Europe. Whilst this claim is dubious, there is no doubt that the 32-metre span is indeed impressive. In fact, the large span combined with the relatively straight river either side meant that when the TV show, A Piece of Cake, asked veteran display pilot Ray Hanna to fly under a bridge, similar to what the World War II pilots did in France to show off their skill, Ray selected Winston Bridge for the stunt. Once the leader of the Red Arrows, Ray owned his own Mark IX Spitfire MH434, which he used for this task. After a number of loops to get a feel for the river channel, Ray would fly his Spitfire at 250 miles an hour through the arch. I've repeated the path of his Spitfire, best I can guess from the footage, with the drone. The drone maxes out just shy of 50 miles an hour, so I sped up this footage 5 times to try and show what it would have looked like from the perspective of a 250 mile an hour Spitfire passing through the bridge. The task is challenging as there is an island of trees in the middle of the river that I'm pretty sure was not there in 1988. Past Winston, we enter a quiet section of river crossed by a stone arch bridge of the former Barnard Castle to Darlington Branch Railway. Known simply as West Tees Bridge, it was built in 1856 and was one of 2 bridges for the railway across the Tees in this area. They were both built to allow the railway to bypass Selby Park by sweeping over the Tees instead. The second, known as Gainford Bridge, is located a mere few hundred metres downstream and is near identical in design. Between the railway bridges at Gainford is a little Victorian oddity. Whilst looking for some coal, some 19th century prospectors accidentally created a spring with their borehole. Water gushed forth, accompanied by a strong smell of rotten eggs, sulphur. At the time, the Victorian world was caught in a fad of healing mineral springs, such as those at both Bath and Harrogate. This spring was formalised in 1830, and a stone fountain was built atop the spring, now known as Gainford Spa. Gainford Spa never caught much attention, and World War I put pay to any chance it ever had. After being vandalised at some point after this, a replica of the original 19th century fountain was built in 2002, and this is the one that can still be seen today. The sulphurous water is still fresh and drinkable apparently, with some claims that it makes a particularly good cup of tea, though I've not tested this hypothesis as of 2024. Just beyond the railway bridge looms Gainford Hall. Constructed in 1609, Queen Elizabeth I was still on the English throne when this impressive house was built for the Vicar of Gainford, Reverend John Craddock. The hall recently underwent its first major restoration in 100 years after being acquired by the Raby estate. Prior to this, it was on Historic England's Buildings at High Risk register. Gainford is a large village with a recorded history going back to the Saxons, though the settlement could be much older, being the possible site of a ford in Roman times. There is a local legend that the village's name came from a dispute with the residents of Yorkshire south of the river in Barforth, who barred the ford, hence the name Barforth or Ford, and the residents of County Durham, who eventually won the fight, gaining the ford, hence Gainford. Heading beyond the tight meanders of Gainford, there is the remains of another railway crossing. This one, a branch of the Barnard Castle to Darlington line, went to the Fawcett Limestone Quarry. Built in 1867, it was demolished between 1981 and 1982. On this relatively straight bit of river, goosanders can be seen breeding in the spring, and grey-lag geese using the fields surrounding the river to congregate when they are not on the river themselves. Grey herons can also be seen here frequently. I think they particularly like the wide shallow channels of the Tees on this section. An unusual bridge crosses the Tees here. The pipe bridge was probably built in 1956 and carries a water main across the river. It has an elegant shape for such a utilitarian structure, and while it has a walkway, it is not publicly accessible. The next crossing is Piercebridge Bridge, where there has probably been a bridge from the 13th century onwards, but the current structure is a 16th century stone arch, probably rebuilt from the older one. There was a battle here during the English Civil War, won by the Royalists, who apparently had a winning streak along the Tees. The bridge would later be damaged by the 1771 flood and was widened in 1781. It is unclear if this was part of the repairs from the flood. This bridge is the current crossing point for the B6275, which partially follows the route of the historic Durr Street Roman road. Indeed, Roman remains are something that Piercebridge is famous for. Under the village green is the remains of one of the largest Roman camps in Britain, much of which can still be seen today through the excavations open to the public. What you can see here is the remains of the courtyard building, which is believed to have been the residence of the Roman commandant. Parts of the walls and the defences of the fort can be seen nearby, including the remains of the East Gate, which would have likely been the main access point to Durr Street. These remains are likely the second fort to be present here, with it being assumed according to English heritage there would have been an earlier one. The earlier fort would have been in the same general area, though there is no general evidence of this fort as of 2024. Durr Street is the general name given to the section of the Romans' military road between York and the Firth of Forth. This route is also often referred to as the Great North Road, to which the A1 is the modern successor. Durr Street was lined with forts, giving the Romans secure access to the often contested area in what is now northern England and Scotland. It had two Roman age crossings of the Tees. The remains of the latter is visible today thanks to a 1970s gravel excavation. Wooden piles were discovered in the river along the older route for Durr Street that passes through the modern site of the George Inn, not far from the current crossing of Piercebridge Bridge. This Roman crossing is believed to have been entirely a wooden structure, which appears to have gone out of use in the 2nd century. There have been many finds by divers around this site of the earlier bridge, including brooches and coins, which may indicate some local cultural significance to the site at the time. Not far downstream of Piercebridge is High Conscliffe, a small village with a historic 12th century church, with parts dating back before the Norman conquest. St Edwin's Church is one of possibly only 3 in England dedicated to this particular saint, who was a 6th century king of much of northern England. The church sits on an outcropping of limestone, the surrounding of which has been quarried away for agricultural lime. This has left the church with a particularly commanding position over the river. Below Conscliffe, the river is surrounded by meadows, which in the spring are full of life. These kind of uncut wild meadows are havens for insects and wildflowers. However, the Tees' meadows are also full of invasive species such as this pretty dame's rocket or this poisonous giant hogweed. Invasive species are a problem because they did not naturally evolve to exist in an ecosystem, nor did the plants that exist in that ecosystem evolve to cope with their presence. This usually leads to serious imbalance, most often the introduced species spreading uncontrollably and pushing out the native species. As we follow the Tees' next broad sweeping meander, we pass the linear village of Merrybent. This is perhaps the newest settlement on the Tees so far, with most buildings here dating from just the 20th century, though the village does have a plant nursery that is older and a railway history like much of this area. There was a railway connection to the village of Barton to the south, whose station, it is claimed, is the only one on the railway network to have never sold a ticket. The trackbed of the old railway is now occupied by the A1. The Tees passes under the A1 just south of Merrybent. The A1 is perhaps the most famous road in Britain and needs no introduction. It is the modern form of the Great North Road, linking the north and south of the island of Britain together with 400 miles of A road and motorway. The crossing of the Tees was built by Cementation Co Limited, starting in 1961, and would be completed in June of 1963. with the Darlington bypass opening some 2 years later in 1965. An average of 43,446 vehicles passed over this section per day in 2023, with the vast majority of these being cars at just under 29,000, and most of the rest were goods vehicles at around 14,500. This means that nearly 16 million vehicles passed over this bridge in 2023 alone. That's the equivalent of nearly double the entire population of London passing over this bridge every year. As the Tees meanders north once more, we reach the outskirts of Darlington. Here, there is a weir built across the river, creating a pool where water can be easily extracted. The consistency of the river's flow, provided by the Green Reservoir all the way back in the Pennines, comes to fruition here, making the Tees a reliable source of water for the waterworks year-round regardless of drought. There has been a water pumping station here since 1849, during the height of the Second Great Cholera pandemic. This is the same year that John Snow of London is credited with making the first connections between dirty water and the deadly disease, though his findings were not generally accepted at first, and he would not confirm his hypothesis for another 5 years, though we do now know he was right. As such, intentionally or otherwise, the Tees Cottage pumping station probably saved many thousands of lives, providing Darlington with clean filtered water for the first time. The pumps initially fed public fountains all over Darlington, many of which can still be seen today. Water mains, as we know them, starting to run to homes and businesses over the preceding years. The pumping station's construction in 1849 was funded by Joseph of the Pease family, who founded the Darlington Gas and Water Company. The Peases were a powerful family of Quakers known for their philanthropy and industrialism in this area. They were involved in many projects such as this. The original beam engine here was replaced in 1904, and this newer engine is still present and marvellously operational. The 1904 engine was one of the last water pumping beam engines to be built for mains use. Designed by Glenfield and Kennedy and built by the Teasdale brothers, it was assembled in Darlington, Neasham Road. The steam cylinders have coreless valve gear and special cut-off valves that make the engine more efficient, the latter also giving the operator better control over the engine's speed, a novelty for these kind of engines. The water pumps serve to provide resistance to the engine rolling back, a big issue when you're dealing with a 14.5-ton flywheel. All this made this engine state-of-the-art for its day, and it arguably represents one of the pinnacles of beam engine development. This was important as the beam engines were already going out of favour in the early 20th century, being generally replaced by more powerful and convenient gas and electric pumps. The slightly unusual choice to go with a steam-powered beam engine here was made as the local workers knew how to run a steam engine already, so training would be easier and cheaper. Beam engines were also considered very reliable technology, a fact that this 120-year-old, still fully working engine would probably verify. The beam engine would run the mains water supply until 1926, when it was replaced by electric pumps. It would remain as a backup and be run once a year until 1967, when it was finally shut down from mains use. In 1975, it was run as part of the 150-year anniversary of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, and after this, it was left until brought back to life in the 1980s as a working museum. The 1904 beam engine was joined in 1914 by a 220 horsepower 4-stroke gas engine manufactured by Richard Hornsby and Sons Limited of Grantham and Stockport. It ran off producer gas, made on site using a producer gas plant, as at the time the pumping station was far from the mains gas supply of the town. The engine has two horizontally mounted cylinders that fire alternately, and an impressive 14-ton flywheel. All this drives a large belt into the vertical cylinder water pumps mounted in a deep pit nearby. There are two sets of cylinders, one that takes water from the Tees to the filter beds and into the storage tanks, and a second set that takes the clean filtered water from those tanks and pumps it to the town supply. This setup ran continuously from 1914 to 1926, when it was replaced by electric pumps on site in order to keep up with increasing water demands and take advantage of newer water filtering technology using chemicals. Similar to the beam engine, the gas engine would be kept in working order as a backup for the electric pumps, being run 1 week a year to this end. Until 1955, when an explosion in the gas producer plant put an end to its main service life. The engine was brought back into operational condition and modified to use natural gas from the mains in 1984, which is what it is still running on today. The engine is very unique in being the only example of such an engine still working in its original form, surrounded by the exact same installation as in 1914, with the only change being the aforementioned running on natural gas. Though the producer plant is still present, it is not operational. After 1967, Tees Cottage pumping station's only running pumps were electric. These would wind down throughout the 1970s, ceasing operation completely by the 1980s, at which point Tees Cottage was fully replaced by the modern waterworks just north of the site. The beam and gas engine of Tees Cottage were brought back to life in the 1980s by a group of people calling themselves the Tees Cottage Pumping Station Preservation Society. They still look after the station to this day and are the reason we can still see all of these engines working in 2024. The Tees meanders along the southwestern corner of the town of Darlington. Darlow is a railway town, and some would even argue the railway town. The Stockton and Darlington Railway was the first to operate passenger and freight services with a steam locomotive, leading many to consider it the birthplace of railways as we know them today. The Stockton and Darlington Railway opened in September of 1825. It will be 200 years old as of September 2025. Its momentous bicentennial will be celebrated in a major international festival known as the S&DR 200, which will be held throughout the Tees Valley in 2025. Darlington is by far the largest settlement we've seen on the river so far. It has a population of over 100,000 as of the 2021 census, which is significantly more than the entire Tees Valley so far. Today it is an important regional hub, being on the East Coast Main Railway line, East-West branch lines near the A1 and A66. The town has a surprisingly long and complex history beyond its more recent exploit of a transport network. There has probably been a settlement here since Neolithic times, and the town seems to have gone through an absolute plethora of names over the centuries. The earliest name suggested is Deethington, which may be in reference to the settlement of Deer North people in Anglo-Saxon, or possibly in reference to the River Skerne, which may have been known as the During at the time, this later becoming Dare. By 1457, the town seems to have been called Darlington, and then Darlington by 1585, the latter of which may be a less than polite reference to the town's supposedly excessively muddy streets. In 1603, King James of Scotland wrote, "Darlington has a bonny church, with a brooch upon the steeple, but Darlington is a mucky town, a mere sham upon the people." The modern name Darlington first appeared in 1577, and possibly came from the Dare name of the Skerne and its tributary Cockerbeck. When in flood, the rivers were sometimes known as the Ings of the town, something they did regularly prior to the modern building up of the banks. The Ings is possibly a Danish term for marshy land, giving the Dar its Ing. The L in the name, it seems, was just added to make the word sound nice. Finally, Tun is just a term for an enclosed village, but is often just used in reference to a settlement. So you could translate Darlington to settlement of the Skerne's marshy land, or something similar if you wished. As the Tees meanders southwest away from Darlington, we pass the handsome Blackwell Bridge. Designed and built by John Green of Newcastle and widened in the 1960s to accommodate what was then the A1, now A66, this is an important crossing linking Darlington with the south. The Tees now heads southeast, meeting the Skerne, its longest tributary at about 49 kilometres long. Immediately after this, the Tees passes under Croft Bridge, another contender for the oldest still surviving bridge on the Tees. The current structure likely dates from the 15th century, though there was possibly a bridge here before that. The current bridge was widened in 1795 by the engineer John Carr, who took special care to preserve its medieval form in the upstream additions he made. The downstream side is the original medieval structure that has a redder colour to the stone. It is worth noting that one Charles Dodson operated within the church of St. Peter at the end of Croft Bridge. Charles's 12-year-old son, also called Charles, wrote many of the surviving contributions to the Rectory magazine, to which all of his family was supposed to contribute. Young Charles was particularly good at coming up with games to entertain his 10 siblings. He also showed a great aptitude for maths and would later become a lecturer at Oxford University. However, Charles is far better known by his pseudonym, Lewis Carroll, author of one of the most popular children's books of all time, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Heading south of Croft, we reach the first railway bridge on the Tees that is actually still in use. Built in 1840, the Croft Railway Bridge carries the numerous passenger trains of the East Coast Main Line over the Tees. I find it quite impressive that a structure built 184 years ago can still handle 125 mph modern trains passing over it regularly. Originally a branch of the Stockton and Darlington line, the East Coast Main Line now carries 20 million passengers a year and links London with Edinburgh, connecting many important towns and cities along the way, including York, Darlington, Durham and Newcastle just in this region. After the railway crossing, the river turns east, but into a tight meander back west and then north again. This brings it to the eastern side of Herworth, called Herworth-on-Tees. Herworth has been present in some form since the 12th century and is known for the rather morbid honour of having 1,500 plague victims buried under its green, these from the 1665 pandemic. Nowadays it is a peaceful and pretty village on the Tees. As the Tees bends away from the east side of Herworth, it is crossed by Low Hale Bridge, a fairly unusual wrought iron lattice structure built somewhere between 1870 and 1879, costing £2,000 shared between Lord Rockerby of Yorkshire and the Herworth ratepayers of County Durham. The bridge is privately owned as of 2024. Fish like to congregate in the channel near the piers of the bridge, though this might just be the shallow water that makes them more visible than elsewhere. The Tees takes another meander south, before we arrive at the village of Neasham, site of a ford that is claimed to have once been part of the Great North Road, something that is entirely possible given how many different crossings made up that route over the centuries. The ford would play host to a ritual where the newly appointed bishops of Durham would go to the centre of the river where County Durham and Yorkshire meet, to be given the falchion, a type of sword, by the Lord of Sockburn Manor. This ceremony still takes place today, though the Croft Bridge is now used instead of the ford, which is probably safer. Interestingly, there was an occasion where the Bishop of Carlisle, Henry Montague Villiers, was welcomed as the Bishop of Durham, but he arrived by train, which stopped in the middle of the railway bridge to allow the ritual to take place there. Beyond Neasham, the river takes a very large meander to the south before heading north again to Middleton St George, and then southeast, passing by the end of Teesside Airport's runway. Originally built as an RAF base, Middleton St George, in 1941, this airfield would serve as a base for the Royal Canadian Air Force throughout World War II. It would be expanded in the 1960s, becoming Teesside Airport. Teesside handled 226,000 passengers in 2023, making it the 27th largest airport in the UK for that year. This is more than a twofold increase from 2018 and has often led to the Teesside Airport being dubbed as the most recovered airport since the 2020 pandemic. Aeroplanes, on average, release 100 times more CO2 per hour than other shared transport such as trains or buses, and are responsible for more emissions globally than all but 5 countries in their entirety. something that will have increasingly severe consequences the longer it goes on for, not least threatening the lowland industries such as those around Teesside, built on marshland barely above sea level. Teesside Airport has set an aim to be net zero carbon by 2030, an ambitious objective. However, it is worth noting that this likely relies on the use of biofuels, which can indeed be carbon neutral with a clean supply chain. However, they require large amounts of land to produce, land that then cannot be used to grow food, give space to nature and provide living space for people, etc. Realistically, the current air industry could not be supported on these types of fuels, at least not without truly enormous sacrifices. Beyond the end of the runway, the Tees meanders east, arriving at the town of Yarm. Nestled into a tight north-pointing meander, Yarm was the Tees' first major port exporting local wool to Scotland, France and Flanders. The port also imported luxury goods, such as wine from Gascony and Flemish cloth, throughout the 12th and 13th centuries. Many of the wooden ships needed for this trade were built on the north bank of the Tees nearby. These were small vessels by modern standards, capable of navigating the Tees' meandering channel to the North Sea. In those days, the river was tidal here, and the ships relied on the high tides to get up and down the river. It would take 3 tides to get as far as Yarm from the coast. Throughout the Middle Ages, and particularly in the 18th century onwards, trading ships got larger. The long journey upriver to Yarm became increasingly unviable for these large vessels, and more convenient for these ships, the port of Stockton would slowly supersede Yarm as the Tees' main port throughout the 18th century. Finally, in 1771, the construction of a bridge to replace the Bishop's Ferry at Stockton blocked the passage of ships upstream for good. Returning to the 19th century, it's time to talk about Yarm's most distinctive modern feature and engineering marvel, the half-mile-long railway viaduct. The Yarm Viaduct's construction began in 1848. 4 years, 7 million bricks and £550,000 later, it officially opened in 1852. Designed by Thomas Granger and John Bourne, built for the Leeds and Northern Line, it consists of 43 arches, the 2 largest of which are stone and span 20 metres over the Tees. The Yarm Viaduct is by far the longest railway bridge over the Tees at 695 metres long, and probably sits somewhere around 13th place in a list of the UK's longest railway bridges as of 2024. It still carries numerous passenger and freight trains without issue. As of 2024, maintenance is underway to reinforce 14 of the arches and remove vegetation threatening parts of the structure. This is routine work for an old bridge, and is more preventative than anything. It is very impressive that such a large and advanced structure requires so little work after standing for 172 years. Next to the railway viaduct is another impressive bridge, and the final contender for the Tees' oldest still standing bridge. The Yarm Road Bridge dates from around 1400, replacing an earlier wooden structure on the orders of Bishop Skirlaw of Durham. It has been heavily modified over the centuries, with one of the arches being replaced with a drawbridge at one point. It was widened from 3.6 to 7.5 metres in the early 19th century, and this is possibly when the drawbridge was finally removed. There is also an underdocumented change from 3 to 5 arches that occurred at some point between its construction and the modern day. In 1643, during the English Civil War, a battle occurred on Yarm Bridge, as the Royalist forces crossing into Yorkshire from the north beat the Parliamentary forces barring their way south. Until 1771, this was the lowest point one could cross the Tees by road, and was also considered the navigational limit for most ships heading upstream. The bridge was sometimes blamed for the flooding in Yarm, and a new iron bridge was built in 1803 to replace it. However, this would collapse the following year, leading to the aforementioned modifying of the old stone bridge instead. This is possibly when the mysterious 2 extra arches were added. As the Tees curves north once more, it meets the River Leven, one of its last major tributaries. This strains a catchment to the southeast in the foothills of the North York Moors, around the famous hill, Rosebery Topping. As the Tees once again continues north, it passes under the Surtees Bridge, carrying the A66, a major road linking Middlesbrough with Darlington back west. Immediately after this are the final 2 railway bridges on the Tees. This carries passenger trains to Middlesbrough, Redcar, Saltburn, as well as the numerous freight trains for the Teesside industries and the port. There has been a carousel of different railway bridges here. In 1830, the world's first railway suspension bridge was built as a test for the concept. It didn't work, due to lack of stiffness and deflecting excessively under load. It required bracing with trestle set into the river just to be usable at all. This was replaced in 1844 by a 3-span trussed iron girder bridge designed by Robert Stephenson. Though failings of similar designs led to it being first strengthened and then replaced in 1882 by a riveted wrought iron girder structure right next to it. This was in turn superseded in 1906 by a steel plate girder structure built on the original piers of the 1844 Stephenson Bridge. And it didn't end there. Movement in the river embankment caused a speed restriction to be imposed on the 1906 bridge, and in 2009, the 1882 bridge was demolished and replaced by one of steel and concrete, designed by HBPW. This is the bridge used by the railway today. The 1906 bridge is still present, though is just used to carry cables. Wonder what's next. The Tees now reaches the outskirts of Stockton, passing under the elegant wrought iron arches of the Victoria Bridge. Designed by Chas Neal and built in 1887 by the Whittaker brothers of Leeds at a cost of £85,000, the Victoria Bridge commemorates the 50th anniversary of Queen Victoria's reign. It was paid for by local councils, the Tramway Company, the North Eastern Railway and Waterboard. It carried trams as well as road traffic until 1931. The Victoria Bridge replaced an earlier structure dating from 1771. It was the building of this earlier bridge that put the final nail in the coffin of Yarm's port upstream. Originally an Anglo-Saxon settlement, based on the higher ground of the northern bank of the Tees, the name Stockton could be a derivation of the Saxon word stock for log or tree trunk, with ton being a reference to a farm. So Stockton meaning farm made of logs. Stock in the context of a place name could also refer to being part of a religious house, such as a monastery, and may have had something to do with Stockton's early relationship with Durham or Norton, both of which were important religious centres in Anglo-Saxon times. Stockton had a shipbuilding industry from the 15th century, and by the 17th, the town and its port were really prospering. Daniel Defoe, writing in the early 18th century, said that Stockton was, a few years ago, all thatched houses, now of brick with sash windows. It has a spacious paved high street, very clean. The Industrial Revolution brought heavy industry, and in 1825 the Stockton-on-Darlington Railway to supply the coal needed for this. While the port was already being replaced by Middlesbrough by this time, Stockton boomed, going from a population of 2,000 in the early 18th century to over 51,000 by 1900. Passing the Tees-Key Millennium Footbridge, the Tees turns sharply east, passing under the Princess of Wales Bridge built in 1992. On the south bank here is the town of Thornaby, home of one of Britain's great industrial stories. Head Wrightson Ironworks and Engineering Company was founded in 1866 by the engineer Thomas Wrightson, who trained at Armstrong's Newcastle, and his colleague Arthur Head. Globally famous for their steelwork and fabrication, Head Wrightson has made everything from bridges to boilers for nuclear power stations. Like many of the industrial complexes of the northeast, Head Wrightson was known for its community spirit. Whilst the work was hard, sometimes uncomfortable and often dangerous, the workers supported each other and felt like their skills were valued. That sense of self-worth is a hard value to understate. Even apprentices were taken very seriously by Head Wrightson, with a full training school dedicated to them. It was known that a job here would offer a lifelong career in or out of the company. Personal contacts of the Wrightsons gave the company plenty of contracts during the rebuilding of Britain after the war, making the 50s and 60s boom times for Head Wrightson. As the second half of the 20th century rolled on, advanced welding techniques and John Wrightson's marketing skills got his company a contract to build 8 boilers for a nuclear power station, and more of these boilers would keep the company going for years. The 800-ton monsters were launched like ships and transported downriver due to their immense size. In 1987, Margaret Thatcher's walk in the wilderness would be photographed on the derelict site of Head Wrightson, the Prime Minister's shining shoes brushing with the dust of a century and a half of industriousness. The photographs were intended by Maggie's government to represent the rebirth of Britain into a new age, with an announcement of companies to develop many ex-industry sites such as Head Wrightson's coming shortly afterwards. However, the famous pictures have come to represent the end of Britain's historic industries and really little else. Maybe this, more than anything, shows how the soul of a community was less reborn and more replaced with something far less significant. Today, the site is occupied by brick buildings holding retail parks and financial services. There's even a university campus. Whilst these places may be clean and comfortable, it's not hard to imagine why these bland buildings are seen as pitiful compensation for the prideful industry, community and sense of self-worth that was lost. Continuing east, the Tees encounters its newest crossing. The Infinity Bridge was built in 2009 as the winner of a competition. Its name came from the infinity symbol made by its reflection in the Tees. The bridge's handrail lights up at night, and the lights change colour as people cross. It was designed by Expedition Engineering and Spence Associates, built for $15 million by Balfour Beatty, Cleveland Bridge and Dorman Long. The bridge has won a number of awards and often represents the concept of moving forward for the area. Another half-kilometre downstream is the Tees Barrage, perhaps one of the most physically significant structures on the river, as it's the current tidal limit. Completed in 1995, the structure made the Tees' water level more stable upstream and prevents pollutants from the estuary from being pushed upriver. This together has made the upstream part of the river more attractive for development. The barrage includes a fish ladder to allow the natural migration of fish upstream. However, comments have been made about the vulnerability of fish as they use it. The Tees used to meander south in this area, and parts of the old channel can still be seen today. The river was straightened in the early 19th century to make the route to Stockton Port shorter. As the Tees approaches Middlesbrough, it is crossed by the Tees Viaduct. At 2.9 kilometres long, this is by far the longest bridge over the River Tees. Built in 1975 with sufficient clearance for ships, even though the ports upstream were all redundant by this time. Now the Tees passes under one of its most unique bridges. The Newport Lifting Bridge is the heaviest of its kind in the world and was the first to be built in England back in 1934. The entire central section could be lifted 37 metres above road level to allow ships to pass, something it once had to do 1,400 times a week. Its massive pulleys and counterbalances were moved by electric motors, which could fully lift the bridge in 90 seconds. There was also a backup petrol engine, so apparently there was also a manual option if even that failed. Ingeniously, the counterweights are simply water tanks that can be filled for use or emptied for removal. This made construction and later maintenance of the bridge far easier. The bridge lifted for the last time in 1990 and the mechanism is no longer operational as of 2024, though the bridge itself is still very much in use and is the last place you can drive or walk across the Tees on a conventional bridge. Beyond, the north bank of the Tees transforms into a true industrial dystopia, or utopia if you're into that kind of thing. This incredible landscape is primarily made up of the chemical works of the former Imperial Chemical Industries, a major manufacturer of many chemical products, including fertilizers, explosives, aircraft fuel, and even radioscopes using a nuclear reactor at one point. It is likely that most people in the industrialised world have encountered a product once made at the Birmingham ICI Chemical Works, the famous Dulux paint brand being one such example. One of the most distinctive parts of this site is the ICI Tower. Used for prulling, a process of turning liquid fertiliser solid by pumping hot liquid through sprayers at the top of the tower as air is sucked in the bottom. The liquid falls and cools, solidifying into small spherical prills. These are collected at the base of the tower by conveyors. They're the kind of thing you may see tractors spreading on fields. This tower was used to make ammonium sulfate prills. I am not sure if it's still in use as of 2024. The fertiliser plant as a whole is still running and owned by American firm CF Fertilizers. The ICI Tower is considered a local historic landmark and piece of industrial heritage. Beyond the Prilling Tower are a number of cooling towers, the largest of which were part of the Howerton Hill power plant that has since been replaced by a biomass plant. The towers are for sale as of 2024 and will most likely be demolished. Moving round the next broad meander, the Tees passes under the Transporter Bridge, an icon of Middlesbrough. Towering over the surrounding area, it is visible for miles. The 143-metre span supports a transversing car suspended by steel cables. that, in 90 seconds, can take 200 people or 9 cars over the Tees. The design meant that ships, even very large ones, could pass by unhindered, only having to take care of a single suspended car, no waiting for the bridge to lift. It was designed by Cleveland Bridge Engineering Co. of Middlesbrough and built in 1911 by Sir William Arrol and Co. of Glasgow. This was the largest operating transporter bridge in the world. However, in 2019 it closed due to a number of engineering issues. Around 30% of the bridge's steelwork needs attention, due to corrosion and such issues as you'd expect on a 113-year-old steel structure. The cables used to suspend the car and transverse it also need replacing. Bear in mind that the long transverser cable alone is around half a kilometre long, so this is no small task. Repairing a structure that stands nearly 50 metres above a river so heavily used by shipping is a nearly impossible task. So the plan is to take the top of the bridge off completely using some massive barges and cranes. This will allow the bridge to be taken inside to be stripped, thoroughly inspected and repaired as necessary. The Tees Combined Authority is already working to gather the funding necessary to repair the bridge, and it is hoped repairs will be carried out in the next 5 years. Just north of the Transporter Bridge is an area of flat marshland. Sandwiched between the Billingham Chemical Works, Teesport and an oil refinery, you'd be forgiven for thinking this was just wasteland. But the former farmland at Saltham provides an important wetland habitat for many wild birds. Many of them winter here, such as these amber-listed widgeons, many of which migrate from Scotland, Iceland, Scandinavia and Russia. They are known to gather in large numbers at just a few UK sites during the winter. Many more colourful birds can be seen here, such as these cute little Eurasian teals, striking shell ducks, and prehistoric-looking northern shovelers. All these can be seen at Saltham in large numbers, which can be oddly juxtaposed with the industrial foreground of the surrounding sites. The red-listed peewits can be seen swooping between the islands where they wade or stand in large groups. Also known as lapwings, these birds are commonly referred to as peewits for their very distinctive intimidation call. In smaller numbers stand the tall curlews, another red-listed bird. They are hard to miss with their tall frames and distinctive curved bills. The colour listings for bird conservation in the UK represent the level of concern that there is for that species' breeding populations, with red being those who have either suffered severe declines or are threatened with global extinction. Unfortunately, the number of birds in this category has doubled since the 1990s, which makes sites like this even more important. Saltham is a good example of how nature can thrive if it's just given some space. There are continuing plans to rewild Saltham, with reductions in grazing livestock, more hedgerows, and a general restoration of its natural wetland state. Middlesbrough started as Middlesbrough in Anglo-Saxon times. The borough refers to an ancient settlement, probably one predating the Anglo-Saxon one, and Middle actually could well just mean middle, in this case the central location between other major settlements in the area, for example Durham, Whitby and Lindisfarne. There's also a chance that Middle was the name of some important Anglo-Saxon. By 1801, Middlesbrough was no more than a farm comprising around 25 people. This farm, and the land around it, was bought by a group of Quaker businessmen, led by a familiar name, Joseph Pease of Darlington, in 1829. A year earlier, Joseph had predicted the bare fields would be covered with busy multitude, with vessels crowding the banks of a busy seaport. The group would begin work on what they called Port Darlington on the site. Joseph was the son of the famous Edward Pease, who was instrumental in the Stockton and Darlington Railway. The railway would arrive a year after the work started in 1830. The booming town that followed is the Middlesbrough we know today. By 1851, Middlesbrough had a population of 7,600 and was well on the way to replacing Stockton as the Tees' main port. Little slice a day from this early boom time. Only a town hall built in 1846 stands in the middle of a field that was once the centre of the town of Middlesbrough. This small building is dwarfed by the current town hall, built south of the railway and finished in 1889. This grand Victorian building serves the dual purposes of municipal function and entertainment value. Perfectly balanced, as all things should be. Moving back to the banks of the Tees, we found a brick-built clock tower with 3 faces. This prominent building was actually constructed for 2 purposes. One, as a time-telling device, though the 4th missing face was actually intentional. Can't be distracting those dock workers now, can we? The second was to house an hydraulic accumulator, a device that stored water under pressure of a weighted piston. This could be used to power devices such as lock gates at the docks. The current tower is believed to date from 1870, and it is thought that the shape of the clock tower is based on that of Darlington's mainline railway station. The estuary of the Tees is dominated by Teesport, to this day a major maritime complex. Teesport is claimed to be the UK's 5th or 6th largest, and in the top 10 for the whole of Europe. 28 million tonnes of cargo go through this port each year, most of which are exports, a rarity amongst large UK ports. The port features a predominant oil refinery, chemical works and container terminal. The Moor pipe comes ashore here, bringing 830,000 barrels of oil ashore a day. That's between its delivery points of Teesside and Emden, Germany. The pipeline runs from the Norwegian Ekofisk field and several UK-owned fields all in the North Sea. It was commissioned in 1975. The landscape here is dominated by the massive bulk cranes of the Redcar ore terminal on the south bank. This terminal is one of the only ports in the UK capable of handling the massive Cape-sized ships. Names such as they are too big to use the Suez or Panama canals and must go round Cape Horn or the Cape of Good Hope to transition from ocean to ocean. In current terminology, only the staggeringly massive China-Max vessels are larger. It does not seem like any terminal on the Tees can currently handle ships that size, as the estuary isn't deep enough. The ore terminal can accept a draft of 17 metres, and China-Max vessels require 25. On the flat land beyond the ore terminal stands the site of the Redcar Steelworks, which only closed in 2015. The works have been demolished over the last decade, culminating in the demolition of the Dorman Long Tower in fall 2021. Given this area's history of iconic industrial communities and landmarks being replaced with developments that in no way actually replace what was lost, it is not surprising that the decision was controversial. Here's hoping the part is listened to as it is built over. On the northern bank of the Tees stands Hartlepool Nuclear Power Station. Starting construction in 1968 and first connecting to the national grid in 1983, the station now houses 2 carbon dioxide gas-cooled nuclear reactors, supplying 1,185 megawatts to the grid. This is enough for approximately 2 million homes according to the owner's EDF Energy. The station is set to close in 2026, and there is talk of replacing it with a new, smaller station using modern modular nuclear reactors, but these plans don't seem to be concrete as of 2024. Located just behind the power station is Seaton Port, featuring one of the world's largest dry docks at 10 hectares. The facilities here are focused on offshore construction and heavy fabrication. The parts of many offshore wind turbines can be seen laid out across the site. Pollution of water bodies can be a complex topic. There are many ways they can be polluted and many ways these pollutants can manifest. Some may sit harmlessly under the river sediment for years before causing mass die-offs of marine life due to being stirred up by a flood or dredging, whilst others will flow downstream and disperse out into the sea only to fall as rain over the preceding years. The one thing that is always true is that there is always consequences, and these are virtually always bad. What is somewhat shocking is how little investigation and transparency there is on this topic. In 2024, there seems to be little reliable information on how polluted the Tees actually is. It is known that there were 990 sewage dumps in the river in 2023, which is a staggering 2.7 times a day on average, but beyond this, it's mostly sensationalised news stories that may or may not be based on actual science. It is likely the Tees is polluted, its lower course in particular due to its industrial history if nothing else. The general lax government policies regarding this will probably not make things much better as time goes on either. It cannot be understated how many negative effects polluted water has, particularly in a major body like the Tees that is used as a source of drinking water and discharges large volumes of water into the sea. The water system of the Earth is all interlinked, and there is no such thing as an isolated part of it. Polluted water will always find its way into your food, shower or drinking glass eventually, no matter where it started. The end of the Tees is marked by the Gares, 2 piers at the end of the estuary. The South Gare was built using large volumes of slag from the ironworks of Teesside in the late 19th century. It made the channel of the Tees easier to navigate for larger ships by guiding the currents in such a way to clean the dredged channel. It was completed in 1888 after taking 20 years of hard labour to build. It seems like the smaller North Gare was also built around this time. On the end of the South Gare there is a still operating lighthouse that assists the numerous ships heading for Teesport in their entrance to the estuary. The old jetties of South Gare are a favoured sight of cormorants, who stand watch. As the Tees completes its journey, 85 miles from Crossfell it passes the Gares and enters the North Sea, perhaps finding its own eternity.